In the quiet northern town of Maple Hollow, nestled deep within the snow-laden landscape of Minnesota, a young boy once disappeared without a trace. It was a frigid winter morning, and fresh snow blanketed the ground like a pristine sheet of white silence. 5-year-old Joshua Coulter had been playing outside, delighting in the crisp, untouched snow, his laughter ringing out into the cold air. His parents had allowed him to play in the yard as they had done countless times before, confident in the safety of their small town. But when they came to check on him just 20 minutes later, he was gone. No tracks leading away, no signs of a struggle, just silence and snow. 8 long years passed. And then, one ordinary morning, Joshua's father made a discovery beneath their neighbor's dog kennel that would shake the town to its core. A moment so chilling, it froze the blood in his veins. Maple Hollow was the kind of town that prided itself on community and calm. With a population hovering just above 2,000, everyone knew each other's names, shared meals, grief, celebrations, and even gossip. The winters were harsh and unrelenting, but the people were warm. Families left their doors unlocked. Children roamed freely after school, building snow forts and sledding down neighborhood hills without fear. It was the kind of place where tragedy seemed almost impossible. Until the Coulters' nightmare began. The loss of Joshua had scarred the entire town. That Saturday morning, the air had been filled with softly drifting snowflakes, the type that fall lazily as if reluctant to touch the ground. Ethan Coulter sat at the kitchen table, eyes scanning documents he knew by heart. Police reports, tip sheets, witness statements, pages that had long lost their color from handling and time. The pile had become a permanent fixture in their home, an altar of sorts to a boy who had vanished into nothingness. Across the room, his wife, Claire, was moving methodically from room to room, cleaning in a rhythm that helped her focus, each swipe of the cloth or clatter of dishes grounding her. Housework had become her therapy, a small semblance of control in a life that had unraveled without warning. Though the seasons changed and years passed, their home remained emotionally frozen, like it had been waiting for Joshua to walk through the door again. As Claire passed the table with a laundry basket in her arms, she gave Ethan a knowing glance. "Still at it?" she asked gently. He nodded, thumbing through another report. "Detective Palmer said they got a couple of new tips last month," he muttered. "Nothing solid, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. After 8 years, even the smallest hint of a lead kept them going. They had learned to survive on fragments of hope. Joshua had been a lively child, full of energy and curiosity, with vibrant red hair and a laugh that could light up the darkest corners of their home. That morning, he had begged to play outside in the snow, and they had given their usual answer. Yes, but only for 20 minutes. Their backyard met the edge of a small wooded patch, a place familiar and seemingly safe, where local children often explored. It wasn't unusual. Nothing had felt out of place, until it was. Ethan had walked out after 20 minutes, just like he promised, but Joshua wasn't there. The search effort that followed had been unlike anything the town had ever seen. Neighbors, police, and volunteers from nearby towns scoured the woods and fields. Search dogs were brought in, divers even cracked through the ice of the nearby lake to investigate beneath the frozen surface. Every house in town was questioned, every vehicle scrutinized. Still, not a single clue emerged. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually the official search was suspended. But Ethan and Claire never truly stopped. The soft chime of the doorbell cut through Ethan's thoughts. He folded the paper in his hand and stood, pulling on his sweater as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, he found Harold Stevens standing there, their neighbor from across the street. Errol was a tall, somber man in his late 40s. His hair had begun to gray early, and his expression rarely strayed from neutral. A decade ago, his own life had been shattered when a robbery took the lives of his wife and son. Since then, he had kept mostly to himself, rarely venturing into social gatherings or small talk. "Morning, Ethan," Harold said, rocking gently on his heels, his gloved hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Sorry to trouble you, but the windstorm last night took out part of your fence. Again, it's blown over onto my side." Ethan's shoulders sagged. "Oh, Harold, I'm really sorry about that. That fence has been a pain for years. I'll get it cleared up, but my welder's still busted, and I haven't had the time to pick up a new one." Harold shook his head with a small wave. "Don't worry about it. I patched it up myself this morning. Just figured I'd let you know." "You didn't have to do that," Ethan replied, caught off guard. "Thank you. Really." "No big deal," Harold said with a shrug. "I had the tools out anyway. Been working on something behind the house." "I heard some noise earlier," Ethan said. "Figured you were building something." Harold gave a non-committal grunt. "Yeah, sorry if the fix doesn't look great." "It's just an old fence," Ethan assured him. "Appreciate it, though." Harold offered a quick nod and turned to go. As Ethan shut the door, Claire came in from the backyard, cheeks flushed from the cold and her scarf trailing behind her. "Was that Harold?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Fence blew down again. He patched it up for us." Claire hung her scarf on a nearby hook and offered a faint smile. "It's been ages since we last sat down with Harold. We should invite him to dinner. Say thanks for fixing the fence." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know, Claire. I'd rather use the evening to go over the new police reports. There might be something worth digging into this time." Claire's smile faded, replaced with a familiar blend of sadness and quiet frustration. "Ethan, we've become hermits. It's been 8 years. We used to be part of this town. Now, we barely speak to anyone." He didn't reply, because she wasn't wrong. Their social world had withered around the same time Joshua disappeared. The loss had consumed them both, gradually cutting off everything that wasn't part of the search. "Harold's been alone ever since his tragedy, too," Claire continued softly. "He lost his wife and child to something horrible. We all suffered." "We know what that kind of loneliness does." Ethan looked down at the stack of files on the table again, his heart heavy. Claire gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe dinner is the right thing to do," she said, "for all of us." After a moment, he exhaled slowly and gave a nod. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll go invite him." "It's been years, Ethan. He must be so alone," Claire murmured as she gently laid a hand on her husband's shoulder, her eyes reflecting the heaviness of shared grief. Her voice held a blend of compassion and weariness, the result of years lived under the shadow of absence. "Maybe we should sit down with him, share a meal. We've all experienced loss. Maybe it would be good for all of us." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His eyes lingered on the stack of weathered documents that had consumed their kitchen table for nearly a decade. Papers filled with dead ends, outdated sightings, and police summaries that never brought Joshua home. He considered her words. Maybe this wasn't just about Harold. Maybe it was about taking one small human step toward a world beyond loss. "You might be right," he finally admitted, voice low. "I'll go invite him for dinner tonight." Claire smiled. Soft, almost imperceptible, but it was genuine. It had been far too long since Ethan had seen that kind of warmth on her face. Pulling on his thick winter coat, Ethan zipped it up and stepped outside. The sharp winter air stung his cheeks as he crossed the quiet street toward Harold's house. Snow crunched beneath his boots, the only sound in an otherwise still morning. Harold's home, a 2-story structure like many others in their neighborhood, had clearly been neglected. The paint had begun to peel, and snow had gathered in thick layers around the porch and windowsills. It looked like no one had shoveled there in days, maybe weeks. Ethan stepped onto the porch and knocked firmly. No answer. He waited a moment, then knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. He was just about to leave when a soft, repetitive thudding noise caught his attention. It came from somewhere behind the house, dull and rhythmic, like someone hammering. Frowning, Ethan made his way around the side yard. His boots sank deeper into untouched snow as he trudged toward the backyard. "Harold?" he called out. "It's Ethan," from across the street. The noise led him to a small wooden structure tucked in the corner of the yard. An old, weathered doghouse that had been there for years. He remembered it well. Harold used to have a dog named Rex. The dog had been gone for a long time now, but what he hadn't expected to see was Harold himself, crouched awkwardly inside the doghouse, adjusting something beneath its floor. At the sound of Ethan's voice, Harold visibly tensed, then slowly backed out of the structure. He straightened quickly, breath short, as though he hadn't realized how long he'd been in there. "Oh, Ethan," he said, catching his breath. "Sorry, I didn't hear you knock." "No worries," Ethan replied, glancing at the small structure. "Didn't mean to startle you. Just surprised to see that old thing still standing. It's been years since Rex, hasn't it?" Harold gave a small, uncertain laugh. "Yeah, I guess I've always had a hard time parting with it. Rex was a great dog. Keeping the kennel, it helps me remember." Ethan nodded. He understood that kind of attachment. After all, Joshua's room still looked the same as it did 8 years ago. Harold motioned to a nearby wooden frame, a larger, partially built doghouse. "Actually, I've been working on a new one. Been thinking of getting another dog. Something to keep me company." Ethan's brows lifted in surprise. "In this cold? You've been building out here?" Harold gave a sheepish shrug. "Weather doesn't stop everything. It gives me something to do." "I used to breed dogs," Ethan said. "Mostly for shows and family homes." "What kind are you thinking about?" "Not sure yet," Harold replied. "Maybe a young one, something mid-sized. Haven't really made up my mind." "Well," Ethan said, shifting to the real reason he'd come. "Claire and I wanted to invite you over for dinner tonight. Just something simple to say thanks for fixing the fence. If you're free, we'd love to have you." Harold looked surprised but not displeased. "Dinner? That sounds good. And if you'd like," Ethan added, "I could help you finish that doghouse this morning. We could stop by a breeder I know afterward. They've got a few great pups available." "Oh." There was a brief pause before Harold nodded. "I'd appreciate that. I should be done out here in a couple of hours, and yeah, dinner sounds nice." "Thanks, Ethan." As the two men parted, Ethan turned to walk back toward his house. But something didn't sit right with him. Harold had been perfectly civil, if a bit nervous, but there had been something odd. The way he reacted when Ethan found him near the kennel, the way his eyes kept flicking back to it even during their conversation. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe Ethan thought it was just Harold being uncomfortable with unexpected company after so long alone. Back across the street, Ethan brushed snow off his shoulders as he stepped into the warm house. Claire was in the living room, tidying up the usual clutter that gathered through the week. Throw blankets, magazines, a few unopened letters on the coffee table. "Said yes," Ethan announced, hanging up his coat. Claire's face brightened instantly. "Really? That's wonderful. What time should I expect him?" "Around 6. Ethan replied, moving back toward the table where he had left the documents. "He's building a new doghouse. Says he's planning to get another dog." Claire paused in her tidying, genuinely surprised. "A dog? After all these years?" "Yeah, I offered to help him with the kennel and take him to a breeder I know. Figured it might do him good." She smiled thoughtfully, walking into the kitchen. "I told you, he's been alone too long. Getting a pet might be his way of trying to heal. Everyone has their own way of moving forward." Ethan returned to his stack of papers, glancing at the latest batch of unconfirmed tips. It just caught me off guard. He's had that old doghouse forever, and now suddenly he's building a new one. Claire opened the pantry, frowning. We're low on everything. If we're going to have company tonight, I want to make something special. Ethan sighed softly. He had hoped to spend the morning combing through these documents, trying to see if any of the recent tips could lead somewhere. Anywhere. I'd go, Claire said gently. But I don't drive well in the snow, and walking in this cold isn't safe. He looked up at her and nodded slowly. She hadn't asked for much. This dinner, the guest list of one, was her way of stepping back into life. Okay, he said at last. I'll get the groceries. Still a bit of time before I help Harold anyway. Ethan had originally planned to spend the morning in quiet focus, combing through the latest batch of reports and supposed leads, trying to piece together anything that might finally point them toward the truth about Joshua. But as he sat down, ready to immerse himself in the familiar frustration of dead ends, Claire's voice called to him from the kitchen. "Could you go pick up what we need for dinner?" she asked, not unkindly. "I'd really like to get the house clean for tonight. And you know how I struggle to drive in this weather. It's too cold to walk, and I don't want to stand around waiting for the bus in this wind." Ethan looked up and saw the hopeful expression on her face. It struck him how little she asked of him these days. And it was Claire, after all, who had encouraged them to reach out, to take this small but meaningful step back toward human connection. Maybe she was right. Maybe they both needed this. He let out a soft breath and nodded. Okay. I've got time before Harold's ready to head out to the breeder anyway. I'll do the grocery run, drop everything off here, and go with him if he's up for it. Claire's face lit up with gratitude, and she hurried to jot down a grocery list, checking the pantry and refrigerator as she called out items for Ethan to grab. With the list in hand, Ethan bundled up again and stepped back outside. The snow had grown deeper since earlier that morning. He paused to shovel a narrow path from their front door to the driveway before starting the car. It took a few minutes for the engine to warm, white breath swirling from his nose and mouth as he waited. Just as he was about to pull out, movement caught his eye. Harold was crossing the street, approaching his window. "Ether," Harold called out. Ethan rolled down the window. "Hey. All set with the doghouse already?" Harold shook his head and rubbed his gloved hands together. "Actually, I forgot I had made plans with a couple of friends this morning. Won't be able to make it to the breeder after all. But I'll still come over for dinner tonight." Ethan nodded, surprised. In all the years they'd been neighbors, he couldn't remember a single time Harold mentioned socializing, let alone making plans with friends. "No problem," he said. "I'm heading to the store now. We'll see you at 6. Harold gave a short nod and walked back toward his house. Ethan watched him go, that strange feeling from earlier returning in force. There was nothing overtly suspicious about what Harold said, but something didn't add up. After all, Harold was famously private. Why now, after so long in solitude, was he suddenly re-entering the world of friendship and dinner invitations? Shaking it off, Ethan turned his attention back to the task at hand. The grocery store was quiet, likely due to the weather warning issued the night before. People were staying home, avoiding the forecasted snowstorm. He moved through the aisles quickly, checking off items from Claire's list and adding a few extras he knew she liked but had forgotten. As he loaded the bags into the trunk and got back into the car, the sky had darkened with heavy gray clouds. The first flurries had already begun to drift down. It was clear the storm would hit sooner than expected. Holding out of the parking lot, Ethan glanced to his left and did a double-take. A familiar blue sedan passed by on the main road. Harold's car. The windows weren't fogged over, and Ethan had a clear view of the driver. It was Harold. Alone. More curious than concerned, Ethan followed at a distance. His route home happened to overlap, and he trailed the car instinctively. After a few minutes, Harold turned into the parking lot of Northwood's Kennels, the very breeder Ethan had mentioned earlier. Ethan slowed as he passed, watching Harold pull into a spot and park. Confusion settled in his chest. Harold had told him he had plans with friends, yet here he was alone going to the dog breeder they had discussed. It was hard to tell what to make of it. For a moment, Ethan considered pulling in as well, just to say something, maybe offer help, but stopped himself. What would he even say? That he had coincidentally followed him? That he'd seen through a harmless lie? Maybe Harold just preferred to go alone, without anyone else's opinions influencing his decision. Still, the dishonesty stuck with him. By the time Ethan arrived home, snow had started falling in earnest. He hurried to unload the groceries, bringing bag after bag into the kitchen where Claire was already preparing ingredients for dinner. "You're back faster than I thought," she said, taking one of the bags from his arms. "Wasn't much traffic," Ethan replied. "Actually, I saw Harold at the kennel." Claire paused mid-motion. "The kennel? I thought he canceled with you." "Did," he said, placing the rest of the bags on the counter. "Said he had plans with friends, but I saw him pulling into the Northwoods lot alone." Claire looked thoughtful. "That is strange, but maybe it's not our place to judge. He could have just wanted some time to himself. Choosing a dog is a personal thing." "Maybe," Ethan muttered, though the inconsistency still gnawed at him. As they unpacked groceries together, Ethan glanced out the kitchen window. Across the street, Harold's car had just pulled into his driveway. Ethan watched as Harold stepped out, opened his trunk, and began to maneuver a metal dog kennel out into the snow. Inside was a large dog, its coloring unmistakable even from a distance. "He's back," Ethan murmured. "Looks like a German shepherd." Claire joined him at the window. "That was fast. He must have really connected with that dog." "Love at first sight, I guess," Ethan said, echoing her tone. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He had bred dogs for years. He knew how long it usually took to go through the paperwork, the screening, the formalities. For Harold to be in and out of the breeder so quickly, it was definitely unusual. They watched as Harold struggled to maneuver the crate across the yard. The dog inside shifted around restlessly, making the task more difficult. "He's having a hard time with it," Ethan observed aloud, frowning slightly. From the kitchen window, Ethan watched as Harold struggled to maneuver the metal dog crate across his snow-covered lawn. The dog inside shifted and twisted, clearly not used to confinement, making the task all the more awkward. Ethan's brow furrowed. Harold seemed to be having a harder time than he let on. "I should go help him," Ethan muttered. Before Claire could respond, he was already heading for the door, coat halfway on. He crossed the street quickly, his boots crunching loudly through the snow. As he got closer, he raised his voice. "Need a hand with that?" Harold looked up, startled, his expression flickering from surprise to something less easy to place. Irritation, maybe even panic. His words came fast, almost too fast. No, I'm good," he said, tone sharper than the moment called for. "I've got it under control. I'll see you this evening." The dismissal was clear and abrupt. Ethan stopped in his tracks, surprised by the response. "All right," he said cautiously. "If you're sure." Harold didn't reply. He turned back toward the crate and resumed wrestling it across the snow, leaving Ethan standing there with a growing sense of unease. He watched for another second, then turned and made his way back home. Inside, Claire was in the kitchen setting vegetables into a colander. She looked up the moment Ethan walked in. "Didn't want help," Ethan said, slipping off his coat. "Said he's fine on his own." Claire nodded, barely missing a beat as she returned to her task. "Some people just don't like being helped. It makes them feel vulnerable." "I suppose," Ethan said, but his voice was distant, his mind elsewhere. Something about Harold's reaction, it hadn't just been pride or independence. There had been a defensive edge to it, something out of place. Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it stuck with him. The day wore on slowly. Outside, the snowfall thickened, cloaking Maple Hollow in a quiet, white stillness. Ethan tried to lose himself in his police files again, forcing his attention back to the leads. The same tired patterns emerged: unconfirmed sightings, vague descriptions, hopeful calls from strangers who believed they'd seen a red-haired boy who might have been Joshua. One report mentioned a child spotted in a town about 200 miles to the south, but the physical details didn't match. Another involved a boy in Montana, enrolled in school under a different name, but after a full investigation, that too proved to be a false lead. Ethan rubbed his temples, a familiar tension blooming at the base of his skull. 8 years of dead ends and dashed hopes. Still, he couldn't stop. Somewhere out there, Joshua might still be alive. And if he was, Ethan refused to be the father who had given up. By the time dusk began to fall, the warm aromas of dinner were already wafting through the house. Claire had gone all out. Pot roast, seasoned vegetables, homemade rolls, and even an apple pie cooling on the counter. It was more effort than she'd put into a meal in months. Ethan knew how much this dinner meant to her, how much hope she was placing in this small gesture of normalcy. As he helped set the table, Ethan glanced toward the window. The snow was still falling steadily. "Do you think he'll actually come?" he asked, placing silverware beside folded napkins. Claire looked up. "Why wouldn't he?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know. He's been acting off today. All the last-minute changes. The way he looked when I offered to help with the crate. It's like he didn't want me near it." Claire gave a gentle smile. "Maybe he's just nervous. After 10 years alone, opening up again probably feels overwhelming. Let's give him a chance." At exactly 6:00, the doorbell rang. Ethan opened the door to find Harold standing there, holding a bottle of red wine. His coat was dusted with snowflakes, his expression composed but guarded. "I hope Red's all right," Harold said, handing over the bottle. "Perfect," Ethan replied, stepping aside. "Come in. Get out of the cold." Claire greeted Harold warmly, taking his coat and thanking him for coming. The tension in the air was faint at first, but gradually loosened as they moved to the dining table. Conversation stayed light, small talk about the weather, local news, harmless topics that asked nothing of the heart. When the meal began, Ethan saw his chance and gently steered the topic toward what had been gnawing at him all day. "So, I saw you picked up a German Shepherd," he said casually, watching Harold closely. "How's it adjusting?" Harold froze momentarily, his fork pausing mid-air. "Fine," he said after a second. "Still getting used to things." Ethan nodded. "I noticed you at the kennel earlier today, on my way back from the store. Wasn't that just after you said you had plans with friends?" Harold's eyes darted briefly toward the window before returning to his plate. "Yeah. My schedule changed last minute. My friend canceled and I figured, why wait? I was excited, so I went." Ethan sipped his wine, giving Harold space. "They processed everything pretty quickly," he observed. "When I used to breed, the paperwork alone could take a good while." Harold shifted in his chair, adjusting the napkin in his lap. "Actually, I placed the order a few days ago. It was ready, I just had to pick it up." The explanation wasn't unreasonable, but something about it didn't line up with what Harold had said earlier, that he hadn't even decided between a puppy or a mid-sized dog. Ethan remembered that detail clearly. Still, he said nothing for now, though. A quiet tension settled in his chest. Sensing the shift in atmosphere, Claire changed the subject. "Harold, Ethan mentioned you lost your wife and son 10 years ago. I'm so sorry. We know what it's like, losing family. Harold's expression softened just slightly. Yeah, he said quietly. It's been hard, living alone for that long. Claire nodded. We understand. When Joshua disappeared, but she didn't finish the sentence. Harold had gone rigid in his chair, his gaze fixed out the window, where the snow now fell in heavy sheets. I'm sorry, he interrupted, suddenly rising to his feet. I just remembered. I left the dog outside in the kennel. I forgot to bring him in before I came over. With the snow picking up, he might be stressed. Ethan stood too. Do you want help? No, Harold said quickly, his voice tight. It's a German shepherd, big, strong. He's not used to other people. I'd rather handle it myself. I'll be right back. Without waiting for a reply, Harold stepped toward the door and grabbed his coat from the rack. His exit was so abrupt, the front door still swung open slightly behind him as the cold wind rushed in. Ethan and Claire stood in silence, staring after him. The warmth of the evening had been cracked, letting something colder inside. Not from the snowstorm, but from the strange air Harold had left behind. Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the swirling snowfall outside their window, eyes narrowing slightly. You're right, he murmured. The wind's starting to really pick up. He hesitated for a moment before asking, Do you want help bringing the dog inside? Harold responded instantly, too quickly, with a voice tinged with anxiety. No, that's okay. The dog's a German shepherd. It's still getting used to me, and it might not react well to strangers. I'll take care of it myself and come back once I'm done. Claire stood, the legs of her chair scraping lightly against the floor. Of course, she said kindly. Just make sure the dog's comfortable. We're just across the street, so there's no need to rush if it takes a while. Harold gave a nod of thanks, then turned and left with surprising urgency, leaving his coat behind on the rack. The speed of his departure unsettled Ethan, more than he wanted to admit. They both returned to the table, but the atmosphere had shifted. The warmth that had filled the room earlier was now undercut by a faint, inexplicable chill. That was strange, Ethan remarked, swirling the wine in his glass. Claire offered a small shrug as she topped off his drink. He's worried about the dog. I can understand that. It's a big step for him. Probably the first connection he's had in years. Maybe, Ethan muttered, unconvinced. Claire studied him for a moment. Imagine if I were gone too, and you had to juggle everything. Grief, work, the house, the silence. That's been Harold's life for over a decade. Taking care of that dog might be the first thing that's given him some comfort in a long time. Ethan didn't argue. Her words made sense, and yet something gnawed at the back of his mind. Time passed. The snow outside grew heavier, the world beyond the window now a haze of white. They waited and waited. The pie Claire had proudly prepared still sat on the counter, untouched. The dining room grew quiet save for the occasional gentle clink of silverware and the low hum of the heater working against the cold. Eventually, Claire broke the silence. It's okay if he doesn't come back tonight. Dogs take time to adjust, especially in bad weather. She stood and began to gather plates. As she passed the door, she paused, her brow furrowing. Oh, he forgot his coat. Ethan followed her gaze and saw Harold's jacket still hanging where he'd left it. It's freezing out, Claire added. Without another word, Ethan rose from his seat, grabbed Harold's coat and his own, and stepped back into the icy night. The cold slapped against his face as he stepped off the porch. The snow had thickened, blanketing the street in white. Each step toward Harold's house crunched beneath his boots, the stillness of the night pressing in around him. Flakes danced through the air under the soft amber glow of the streetlights, swirling like delicate stars. Harold's house loomed ahead, dark and silent save for a single faint glow emanating from a window at the back, probably the kitchen. Ethan approached the front door and knocked, firmly at first, then again, louder after a pause. No answer. He checked his watch. Over 30 minutes had passed since Harold had left their house, long enough to bring a dog inside. Too long, considering the weather. A sharp bark cut through the silence, pulling Ethan's attention toward the backyard. The dog was still outside. That didn't make sense. Ethan hesitated only briefly before making his way along the side of the house. "Harold?" he called. "It's Ethan. I brought your coat." He turned the corner and stepped into the backyard, the snow now up to his shins in places. The light from the kitchen window spilled across the yard, casting a golden path toward the small dog kennel. The German Shepherd was there, restless and pacing, its chain rattling with each movement. It barked once more, then whimpered, glancing toward Ethan and then quickly back toward the kennel. The dog's posture wasn't aggressive, it was agitated, even anxious. Something was wrong. Ethan looked around, scanning the backyard and the windows, but there was still no sign of Harold. The large doghouse he'd been building earlier that morning was still unfinished, standing awkwardly against the fence. Another inconsistency. Harold had said it would be done today. "Harold," Ethan tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Harold's car was still in the driveway, untouched, and in this storm there was no way he would have walked anywhere. Not without a coat. A knot began to form in Ethan's stomach. He pulled out his phone and dialed Harold's number. "Voicemail." Again. The German Shepherd barked more urgently now, pacing tighter circles. Ethan stepped closer, cautiously. Years of working with dogs gave him the experience to approach with care. He crouched slightly, speaking in low, calm tones. "Easy, buddy, easy. I'm just here to help." The dog stilled, whining, its eyes flicking toward the kennel again. That's when Ethan noticed it. A small detail, almost missed in the dark, a metal glint near the floor of the doghouse. Squinting, he moved a little closer. It wasn't just a doghouse. There, embedded in the floor, was a trap door, a solid wooden panel with a weathered metal handle and a padlock currently unlatched. Resting atop it, the lock was old, slightly rusted, but functional. The edges of the panel bore subtle grooves as if it had been opened and closed many times. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, not from the cold. Why would Harold install a locked hatch beneath a doghouse? The shepherd barked again, but this time it wasn't loud, it was desperate. Driven by instinct and concern, Ethan slowly unhooked the dog's chain and led it a few feet away, securing it to a fence post. The animal didn't resist, only paced anxiously in place. Ethan returned to the doghouse, heart pounding. He crouched low and reached for the handle, fingers brushing the cold metal. It was heavier than he expected. With effort, he pulled it open, and what he saw beneath the trap door made his blood turn to ice. Ethan stepped backward instinctively, his pulse quickening. His eyes stayed fixed on the trap door now exposed at his feet, its edges darkened with age, the metal handle gleaming faintly in the cold night air. His thoughts scrambled. Whatever was down there, Harold had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Reaching for his phone with shaky fingers, Ethan quickly dialed Claire. When she answered, her voice calm and curious, he didn't waste time. "Claire," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "I found something in Harold's backyard. Something bizarre. There's a hidden door in the floor of the doghouse, like a trap door, or maybe even the entrance to an underground bunker." "A bunker?" Claire repeated, surprise audible. "What do you mean, a bunker?" "There's a latch, a metal handle, everything, like something you'd see in a Cold War documentary. The dog is still outside, chained up, but Harold's nowhere to be found. His car's here, his phone goes straight to voicemail. It's like he just vanished. Claire was silent for a beat. Then, cautiously, "Do you think? Could he be down there? Maybe he fell or something, got stuck?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "The padlock on the door wasn't even locked. It was just sitting there. Someone could be inside. But I keep thinking, why build a doghouse over a bunker entrance at all?" "Ethan, that could be dangerous," Claire warned. "You don't know what's down there. Maybe you should call the police." "Your battery was low earlier. I'll call them from here." Ethan hesitated, torn. "All right," he said after a pause. "But just tell them it's a welfare check. Say I'm worried Harold might be hurt or trapped. His car's outside, the house is locked up, and no one's answering. Something's not right. Promise me you won't go down there," Claire said firmly. "Come back home. We'll wait for the police together." "I promise," Ethan replied, but even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the trap door. His logical mind knew she was right, but the other part of him, the part that had grown used to chasing every unlikely lead, that had been clawing for the truth about Joshua for 8 exhausting years, was already imagining what might lie beneath. Then, from the darkness below, a sound broke the silence. A soft metallic scrape. Ethan froze. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, the sound of metal on metal, like someone climbing a ladder. Then another noise, this time louder. Footsteps. He took a step back, eyes glued to the trap door as it slowly shifted. The wooden panel lifted, the padlock clattered to the side, and from the shadowed depths, Harold began to emerge. The older man crawled out awkwardly, his movements sluggish. When he finally rose to his feet and saw Ethan standing there, his face twisted in disbelief, then quickly darkened into something more unsettling. "Ethan," Harold said, voice taut and controlled, but beneath that calm tone, tension vibrated like a taut string ready to snap. "What are you doing here?" Ethan held up Harold's forgotten coat, using it as a convenient excuse. "You left this at our house. When you didn't come back, I thought I'd bring it over, but then you didn't answer the door. The dog was barking like crazy." "It's still outside, Harold. In this weather." Harold took the coat slowly, his hand lingering on the fabric. "Thanks," he said. "Yeah, about the dog. It's still not adjusting. I don't think it's ready to come inside yet. I hope you understand." Ethan didn't answer. His eyes shifted to the open trap door at Harold's feet. "What's down there?" Harold's jaw clenched. "Nothing you need to worry about." "I was trying to find you," Ethan pressed. "You weren't answering your phone. You weren't in the house. Your car's still out front. Where else would you be?" Instead of answering, Harold looked toward the German shepherd. "You moved my dog. It was barking nonstop at the bunker," Ethan explained. "I moved it to calm it down." "That dog wasn't barking at me, Harold. It was barking at that door." Harold's lips thinned into a tight line. Ethan's voice hardened. "Why did you lie? You said you were going to bring the dog inside. You said the new kennel would be finished today, but it's not. You told me you were meeting friends this morning, but I saw you at the breeder, alone. What's going on, Harold?" Harold didn't answer. His eyes flicked between Ethan and the trapdoor, calculating. The only sound was the low whine of the German shepherd and the wind rustling through the snow-laden branches. Then, without warning, Harold lunged. Ethan barely had time to raise his arms before the older man slammed into him. They stumbled back, boots slipping in the snow as they grappled. Harold's strength was unexpected, fueled by desperation and fear. "You should have stayed out of this," Harold snarled, landing a punch to Ethan's ribs. The air left Ethan's lungs in a gasp, but muscle memory kicked in. Years of physical work had left him strong and solid. He blocked the next swing and shoved Harold off balance. "What are you hiding?" Ethan demanded, circling cautiously. But Harold didn't answer. He charged again, this time ramming his knee into Ethan's gut and knocking him toward the trapdoor. Ethan barely caught himself from falling in. "Get in there," Harold said, panting. His voice was eerily calm now. "Crawl down. Now." Ethan stood, chest heaving. "You can't make me." A dark smile curled on Harold's lips. He reached behind his back and pulled out a handgun. "Then I'll drop you in myself," Harold said. "Your choice." Fear surged through Ethan, but he didn't let it show. His eyes stayed on the weapon. "Claire called the police. They're already on their way. If you fire that thing, every neighbor's going to hear it." Harold's face twisted in frustration. The gun didn't waver. "You don't understand," Harold said, his voice breaking at the edges. "You don't know what's down there. What I'd been hiding. It wasn't supposed to happen." Ethan's heart pounded. "Then show me. Let me see. Let's end this." But Harold didn't lower the gun. Instead of pulling the trigger, Harold lunged forward and struck Ethan across the face with the butt of the gun. The blow landed hard above Ethan's eye, splitting the skin and sending him stumbling backward, half blinded by pain and the sudden warmth of blood trailing down his cheek. But Harold wasn't finished. He kept shoving Ethan toward the narrow entrance of the doghouse, forcing him down, trying to make him crawl into the darkness below. Despite the ringing in his ears and the disorientation from the hit, Ethan fought back. His instincts took over. He grabbed Harold's wrist, twisting it with all the strength he had left. The weapon clattered from Harold's grip, hitting the wooden slats and skidding across the doghouse floor. With one desperate kick, Ethan sent the gun sliding across the boards until it dropped into the open mouth of the bunker below, vanishing into the shadows with a metallic clang. Harold roared with rage and lunged again, but this time Ethan was ready. He sidestepped and used Harold's momentum to his advantage, sending him sprawling into the side of the doghouse. The structure creaked under the impact. Then, cutting through the night air like a blade, the sound of police sirens wailed in the distance. Harold froze. The anger in his eyes flickered into panic. He turned toward the street, and within seconds 2 squad cars pulled up, their flashing red and blue lights bathing the snow-covered yard in bursts of color. Doors flew open. Officers emerged with their hands near their holsters, eyes wide assessing the scene. "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. Both men raised their hands. Ethan immediately, Harold more slowly, reluctance etched into every movement. His face was tight with frustration and defeat. The officers quickly moved in, separating the 2 men. One officer pulled Ethan aside to check the bleeding gash above his eye, while another restrained Harold and pressed him up against the doghouse. "What's going on here?" the officer beside Ethan asked. Before he could answer, Claire appeared at the edge of the yard. She had followed the cruisers across the street, her face drawn with worry. "Ethan, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, though his face was streaked with blood. He quickly explained everything: the strange behavior, the discovery of the hidden bunker beneath the doghouse, the escalating confrontation, and finally how Harold had drawn a weapon. "He pulled a gun on me," Ethan said grimly. "I managed to knock it away. It fell into the bunker." The officer turned to Harold, who remained silent. His expression hardened. "Is that true, sir? Did you assault this man and threaten him with a firearm?" Harold didn't speak. "We're going to have to take you in," the officer said. His partner recited the Miranda warning while cuffing Harold's hands behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Harold was being led toward one of the squad cars, another police vehicle arrived, followed closely by an ambulance. Paramedics jumped out and rushed to Ethan, who waved them off as they dabbed at the blood above his eye. Meanwhile, more officers secured the scene. One of them approached the doghouse and peered down into the opening. "There's something down here," he reported. "I see metal stairs leading down into what looks like an underground room." Before anyone could move, a new sound echoed from the open bunker. The unmistakable clank of someone climbing metal stairs. Instantly, every officer on the scene tensed, drawing their weapons and training them on the trap door. A paramedic pulled Ethan back. Claire clutched his arm tightly, her breath hitching with fear. The noise grew louder. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the bunker. It was a boy. He looked about 13, with unkempt reddish hair and a frame so thin he looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. His skin was pale as frost. His wide, frightened eyes blinked rapidly against the flood of flashlight beams that converged on him. In his shaking hands was Harold's gun. "Drop the weapon," an officer shouted. But the boy didn't drop it. He looked around wildly, terrified by the strangers surrounding him, pointing guns, barking orders. He raised the weapon, clumsily, without aim, swinging it back and forth as if unsure who to trust. "Dad!" the boy shouted, locking eyes with Harold. "I won't let them take you. I'll protect you, just like you said." His voice cracked, fear and desperation woven into every word. "I'm ready. I can be a soldier. I'll guard our home." The officers hesitated. Though the boy was holding a deadly weapon, it was clear he didn't understand what was happening. He wasn't an aggressor. He was a confused child, caught in something far beyond his understanding. "Son," one officer said gently, "you need to put the gun down. You're not safe holding it. No one wants to hurt you." "I know how to use it," the boy shouted. "Dad taught me. The country's at war. You're the enemy. You want to take my dad away?" Ethan stared at him, stunned. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear anything else. There was something achingly familiar in the boy's face. The jawline, the color of his hair, the way his eyes flicked around, frightened but sharp. "Joshua," Ethan whispered. The boy turned, confused by the name. "Joshua," Ethan said louder, taking a cautious step forward. "My name is Ethan. That woman over there is Claire. We're your parents." "You're lying," the boy shouted, trembling. "My mom died. Dad said she was shot by the military. He saved me." Claire stepped forward, tears streaking down her face. She pulled her phone from her pocket, hands trembling, and held the screen out for him to see. It was a photo, her home screen, of a little red-haired boy about 5 years old, smiling, carefree, dressed in winter clothes. "You were kidnapped," she said, her voice thick with emotion. 8 years ago. We've been looking for you ever since. You've been gone for so long, Joshua. Please. We missed you so much." The boy blinked at the photo. His arms began to lower. The gun wavered. His lips parted, but no words came. The boy turned toward Harold, his wide eyes silently pleading for answers, some shred of the truth to make sense of the chaos now unraveling around him. But Harold wouldn't even look at him. He kept his gaze fixed on the snow-covered ground, jaw clenched, refusing to offer a single word. The weight of betrayal began to sink in. Seizing the moment, one of the officers slowly stepped forward, voice low and calm. "It's okay, son. You're safe now. Just let me have the gun." The boy, still stunned and confused, didn't resist. He allowed the weapon to be gently removed from his hands, and the officer swiftly disarmed and secured it. Joshua's attention returned to Claire's phone. He stared at the old photo on the screen, a boy with a shock of red hair and a bright, carefree smile. The glimmers of recognition began to crack through his confusion, stirring something long buried beneath years of fear and fabricated memories. "We're not in a war, are we?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Claire fought to steady her voice. "No, sweetheart. There's no war. There never was." She took a cautious step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Harold told you he was your father, but he isn't. Your real father and I have been looking for you every day, for 8 long years." Reaching out slowly, she touched his hand. At first he flinched, but then he allowed her to hold it. The contact sent a jolt of emotion through her. It was as though his skin remembered hers. A fragment of something real breaking through years of lies. Paramedics quickly moved in, wrapping a shock blanket around Joshua's thin frame. Claire walked beside him, never letting go, guiding him gently toward the ambulance. Ethan stood back for a moment, watching it all unfold. His heart raced with a complex mix of disbelief, relief, and overwhelming joy. He'd spent nearly a decade fearing the worst, and now his son was alive, right in front of him. An officer approached him quietly. "Sir, we'll need to ask you and your wife some questions, but first let's get you checked out." Ethan nodded, barely registering the words. His gaze remained locked on the ambulance, where Joshua sat now, wrapped in warmth, talking quietly with the medical team. The next few hours passed in a haze. The gash above Ethan's eye was cleaned and bandaged. His bruised ribs were examined. Nothing broken, thankfully. The physical wounds were manageable. The emotional weight was something else entirely. Inside the ambulance, Joshua sat clutching a paper cup of warm tea, the blanket still around his shoulders. He glanced warily at the adults around him, strangers who spoke with kindness, but who had just torn apart the only world he had known. Claire sat beside him, not crowding, simply present. Ethan approached slowly. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Joshua shrugged. "I don't know," he mumbled. "Everything's different than what Dad Harold told me." A kind-faced detective, Martinez, she had introduced herself earlier, sat across from them, her notepad resting in her lap. "Joshua," she said softly, "we know this is confusing, but can you tell us about life with Harold? Did he ever hurt you?" Joshua shook his head. "No. He trained me a lot, made me do push-ups, run laps in the yard. Lately, he has been teaching me to shoot. Said I needed to be ready when he was gone, that the war would get worse." He looked out the window at the peaceful street. "He told me to hide in the bunker if anything ever happened, that the outside world was too dangerous." "Do you know what year it is?" Detective Martinez asked. Joshua frowned. He said time doesn't matter in war. Those things change. He told me it was 2007. The detective blinked. "Joshua, it's 2015. You've been missing for 8 years. The boy looked down, trying to grasp the enormity of it. "I've been in the bunker as long as I can remember." Ethan exhaled slowly, struggling to comprehend just how thoroughly Harold had manipulated their son. "There is no war," he said again, quieter this time. "There never was. Harold made it all up." At that moment, another officer approached the ambulance. "We've started going through the bunker," he reported. "It's a full survival setup. Food, water, air filters, generator, first aid supplies. There are even old textbooks, survival manuals, and a few suppressed firearms." Martinez nodded grimly. "He planned for the long haul." She turned back to Joshua. "Did Harold ever let you go outside?" He shook his head. "Never. He said sunlight was dangerous, that enemies might see me. He only went out for supplies. Said he helped other survivors. Told me one day, when I was old enough, I could help too." Ethan felt sick to his stomach. Harold had imprisoned his son for years with nothing but fear and fantasy. "The dog," he said aloud, realization hitting. "The German Shepherd. He got it to guard the trapdoor, didn't he?" "That's our working theory," the officer confirmed. "And the new doghouse? Meant to make the entrance harder to detect. Looks like Joshua was getting older, more curious. Harold needed more control." Claire wrapped an arm gently around Joshua's shoulders. "You don't have to go back there," she whispered. "You're safe now." The forensic team had arrived and begun cordoning off Harold's property. Yellow tape fluttered in the cold breeze, and curious neighbors had gathered despite the late hour, whispering among themselves. Eventually, the paramedics advised that Joshua be taken to the hospital for a full checkup. Years in isolation had almost certainly impacted his health. "We want to go with him," Claire said, voice trembling. "Please, we just got him back." The officer nodded. "Of course." As the ambulance pulled away, Ethan and Claire sat on either side of their son, both quietly overwhelmed. The road ahead would be long, filled with questions, therapy, and a slow rebuilding of trust. But they had found him. Against all odds, they had found their boy. And now, for the first time in 8 years, they had a chance to be a family again. Once the paramedics gave the go-ahead, the ambulance departed for Maple Hollow Memorial Hospital, its lights cutting through the falling snow as Ethan and Claire sat on either side of their long-lost son. Though reunited, there was a palpable distance, an emotional barrier they didn't dare breach too quickly. For Joshua, they were still strangers in all but biology. The gap of 8 years wasn't something words alone could bridge. At the hospital, doctors immediately took Joshua in for a full evaluation. Ethan and Claire waited in the hallway, their nerves frayed and their thoughts spinning in endless circles. Every passing second brought both hope and dread. Hope that their son was physically unharmed, dread about the psychological toll he might carry. Detective Martinez arrived not long after and joined them in the waiting area, her face lined with fatigue and the weight of the case. "Harold isn't talking much," she began quietly, "but based on what Joshua's told us so far and from what we've seen in the bunker, it looks like he took your son the very day he disappeared." Claire's breath hitched, tears brimming instantly in her eyes. "Why would he do that?" "We believe he acted out of some deep psychological break," the detective continued gently. "He had that old war bunker on his property long before Brazil. It looks like he modified it over the years, possibly after the loss of his own family." Ethan nodded grimly. His wife and son were murdered in a home invasion about 10 years ago. He shut down after that, barely spoke to anyone. "I always thought he was just grieving. I never imagined." Martina's expression softened. "It's very likely that the event triggered something, an obsessive need to recreate the family he lost. He didn't just abduct Joshua, he built an entire false reality around him." Claire clutched Ethan's hand tightly, her voice trembling. 8 years of lies. Our son. He doesn't even know what the real world is. "The recovery ahead will be challenging," Martinez acknowledged. "But children, even after trauma, have a remarkable capacity for resilience. With the right support, therapy, structure, love, he can come back from this." At that moment, Dr. Patel, the pediatrician overseeing Joshua's care, approached with a clipboard. "Physically, he's malnourished," the doctor reported. "His vitamin D levels are extremely low, which is consistent with prolonged lack of sunlight. His muscle development is below average, likely from limited physical activity, but there are no signs of direct physical abuse. From what we can tell, he was regularly fed and kept in sanitary, albeit isolated, conditions." Claire covered her mouth, releasing a sob of sheer relief. Ethan reached out, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "Can we see him?" he asked. Dr. Patel nodded. "Yes, but please go gently. He's asked a few questions about you, which is a very good sign, but don't expect instant recognition or warmth. It's going to take time." When they stepped into Joshua's hospital room, he was sitting upright in the bed, wrapped in a hospital blanket. He looked impossibly small amidst the crisp white sheets, his eyes cautious as they scanned the doorway. He didn't shrink back when they entered, but neither did he relax. "Claire, Claire said softly, pausing a few feet from his bedside. "I," Joshua replied after a long pause, his gaze fixed on her. "Are you really my mom?" Claire nodded, eyes already glistening with tears. Joshua turned toward Ethan. "And you're my real dad?" "Yes," Ethan said, his voice catching. "We've never stopped looking for you. We never gave up." Joshua was quiet for a long moment. "Harold, he told me my mom was dead, and that the world outside was dangerous, full of enemies." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Claire, trying to find the words. "Harold lost his wife and son a long time ago," he said carefully. "I think that pain twisted something inside him. What he did was terribly wrong. He made you believe things that weren't true. But you're safe now, and we're here for you." Joshua hesitated. "Am I going to live with you now?" "You're okay with that?" Claire replied gently. "Your room is just like you left it, but we'll go at your pace, one day at a time." Joshua nodded slowly. "I don't really remember you," he admitted. "But when I saw your picture, something felt real, like a memory I couldn't quite grab." "It's okay," Ethan said, tears in his own eyes. "We'll figure it out together." Over the next few days, as Joshua remained in the hospital for observation, news of his discovery spread like wildfire. Local media hounded the family for interviews, but Ethan and Claire declined them all. Their focus was on their son, not on headlines. They brought photo albums from home, sitting by Joshua's bed and showing him pictures from before his birthday parties, vacations, and the family dog. Slowly, the boy began to ask questions. Small ones at first, about the house, the neighborhood, and eventually, about himself. Meanwhile, Harold was charged with multiple felonies, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, assault, and weapons violations. Investigators found a disturbing set of journals in the bunker. In them, Harold chronicled his descent into paranoia, his obsession with war, and his delusional belief that the world had ended and needed to be rebuilt. The picture that emerged was one of tragic loss turned into delusion, delusion twisted into control, and control morphing into quiet cruelty. Ethan often sat by the hospital window at night, watching snow drift past the glass. His heart was filled with both devastation and gratitude. So many stolen years, but now, finally, a chance to begin again. It wouldn't be easy. Joshua would need time, patience, and professional help to overcome the trauma of his captivity. But they had him back. They had a second chance. And for the first time in 8 years, they had hope.